Takayama Eizamon stood waiting at the mouth of Edo Bay. Sweat dripped down his brow as he peered into the distance at the anchored ships, belching dark smoke into the air like so many floating volcanoes. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Barbarian ships were supposed to go to Nagasaki. Like always, they had to. 6 days earlier, as the alien black hulls had steamed into view, his masters had scrambled to do anything they could to avoid this moment. He had been the second imposter sent out to convince them to leave, ordered by his overlords to pretend that he himself was the governor of Uraga, to placate the stubborn visitors who were insisting upon speaking to the person in charge. But the canny sailors had again seen through the ruse and sent him back with nothing but threats of force and a gift. White flags. Ships had stayed. So now here he was, and here everyone was. Thousands of samurai lined Kurihama Beach, and behind them, holidaying spectators munching on snacks and gossiping, waiting for whatever was about to happen. For Kayama, the personal and public failure of it was almost intolerable, and the tension close to overwhelming. And in that, he was not alone. It was July 14th, 1853, and the anxious and curious multitudes had assembled for one of the most unique events in Japanese history. The 4 gigantic, dark American vessels, anchored just a stone's throw away, had cleared their decks and run out their guns. Their test firings had boomed provocatively around the bay. The message for Kayama had been clear. If the Americans were attacked, Japan's capital city, Edo, would be destroyed entirely, and the Japanese were to use the white flags to surrender once the power of the foreign guns was finally understood. Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry of the U.S. Navy, grizzled veteran of the 1812 and Mexican-American War, had refused to meet any but the highest-ranked official, remaining aloof in his cabin. Until now. Shots of salute rang out around the bay as 15 boats carrying 400 heavily armed men put out from the enemy ships and rowed swiftly ashore under their strange blue and red striped and starred banner. The first men to alight bore musical instruments, not weapons, while behind them strode the man who was clearly the Tono, their lord, Matthew Perry. He was flanked by 2 enormous black-skinned men bearing a mysterious, ornate box. This was the nearest to Japan's capital that a foreign delegation had been permitted to land in over 200 years, and the most hostile foreign troops to set foot on Japanese soil since the last Mongols were thrown back into the sea 600 years before. The alien music caterwauled, the barbarian officers barked strange orders like dogs, and the box and the letter it contained from the king of the enemy, a man they called their president, was handed over to Toda Ujiyoshi, finally the true governor of Uraga, representing His Highness, the Shogun. The Americans announced they would be back next April or May, and weighed anchor. It was all over in half an hour, but they were 30 minutes that changed the world. 30 years before, the Japanese scholar Aizawa Seishisai had written, "Today the alien barbarians of the West, the lowly organs of the legs and feet of the world, are dashing about across the seas, trampling other countries underfoot, and daring, with their squinting eyes and limping feet, to override the noble nations. What manner of arrogance is this?" Now the arrogant alien barbarians of the West had accosted Aizawa's own country. Would Japan be the last in a long line of noble nations to be trampled underfoot and overwhelmed? The U.S. Navy Leviathans returned earlier than promised in February 1854, and this time they negotiated for 23 days before coming to terms. But the consequences were not just those scrawled on the fine Japanese paper. Japan as a nation had suffered a psychological humiliation, and the treaty proved to be the first of many increasingly insulting deals she would be strong-armed into signing over the next decade, finally prized open by the hungry grip of colonial powers. The U.S. Navy's brazen infraction started a ripple that would eventually turn into a powerful wave, and then an unstoppable tsunami to shape the coming 20th century. Indeed, within 50 years of Perry's gunboat diplomacy, the once peripheral, semi-feudal Japan had become one of the most powerful nations on Earth. But why was Japan so isolated? What had led to its generations of long distrust of foreigners, its need to keep the world at arm's length? While the rest of the world had been clamouring outwards and slowly connecting across the years, What had kept Japan's gaze firmly inwards? This is that story, a story that reaches centuries back and continues to mold the world today. This is the story of Japan and the West. The Perry incident can trace its roots back more than 3 centuries to a time when Japan was only vaguely aware of the world outside Sankoku, the 3 civilized realms of Japan, the Chinese Ming Empire, and Tenjiku, the lands of Buddha's birth, the northern India of today. That Mongols, Arabs, and other barbarians existed was known, but they were generally of little concern. Aside, of course, from when they charged in to kill, pillage, and burn, as they had when Genghis Khan and his successors had destroyed China and Korea, and only the Shinpu, divine winds, had saved Japan from being overwhelmed by the Mongol war machine. Whether 16th century Europeans were among the known barbarians is unclear, but Christendom, as it was generally known at the time by its own inhabitants, was a realm obsessed with accessing the legendary riches of China and Japan, or as they knew it, Cathay. Marco Polo had described the land of Chipangu with semi-breathless amazement, as a place where the dead were buried with giant red pearls in their mouths, and the ruler's palace was roofed and floored in gold, 2 fingers thick. Generations of Western European adventurers had dribbled with greed. But there was a vast and seemingly insurmountable problem. They had no real idea how they could get there. The known overland and Red Sea routes through which Oriental products such as silk normally reached Europe were controlled by enemy Muslim empires, and, as far as they could ascertain, no other sea route existed. Columbus and others, knowing by now that the earth was round, hypothesized that Chipangu must lie on the other side of the Great Ocean, and it would provide an ideal base from which to commence trade with the Great Khan in China. But when Columbus managed to cross that very ocean, his men found not Chipangu, but a whole new world that they had not even known existed. The Portuguese, meanwhile, were trying another way, inching slowly ever further around the tip of Africa in their search of Oriental wealth, and Prester John, a mythical Christian king who they believed ruled an Eastern kingdom with whom to ally in their struggle against Islam. After 50 years of attempts, they achieved their goal, and Vasco da Gama's small fleet entered the Indian Ocean in 1498. In Africa and Asia, realms used to grander fare than the Portuguese possessed, ruler after ruler failed to be impressed with the poor quality and meagre quantity of the European gifts. So the Portuguese did what they did best, and resorted to piracy. Portuguese fleets moved ruthlessly ever eastwards year by year, seizing bases and strongholds in Africa and Asia to provide their fleets with infrastructure and supplies. Rumours of their behaviour spread like wildfire. The Guangdong Tongji recorded that the Phalangi kidnapped numerous small children under 10 years old, roasting and eating them. The people of Guangdong were terrified. It took the Portuguese several decades to regain a modicum of trust, and only when they turned mercenary to destroy pirates on China's behalf were the tables turned. At some point, the Portuguese encountered their first Japanese people, probably equally cutthroat pirates raiding the coast of China, or perhaps traders in a Southeast Asian port. And so, finally, after centuries of European speculation and salivation, Marco Polo's famed land of pearls and gold was nearly within their grasp.